The European Union is famous for adopting a lot of regulations every year. However, the vast majority of them are not adopted according to the procedures, be them formal or informal like trilogues, that we just have examined together. The reality of European policy making may in fact be compared to a gigantic iceberg. The tip of the iceberg, which appears above the sea level, represents the legislations adopted under the procedure we've just examined. These are around 50, 70 legislations adopted every year, such as the Birds Directive or the Data Retention Directive. The latter requires telecom operators to retain certain categories of data, such as phone calls made and emails sent, for a given period of time for the purposes of investigating, detecting, and prosecuting serious crime and terrorism. There are many other pieces of legislation which are so wide in scope. Below the water sea level, however, there is a much larger portion, not necessarily visible to the eyes, that represents the real bulk of European policy making. These are acts that are adopted to implement the major legislative acts, those I just mentioned, and which represent the tip of the iceberg. These technical regulations, because that's what they are, represent around 2,000 pieces of legislation every year. Do you remember the energy labeling of products mentioned in the previous lecture? Well, this is a very good example of one of those technical measures adopted under an alternative channel, often called comitology. Other recent examples include the authorization of a new pharmaceutical product, the country of origin labeling for food, or allowing body scanners at airports. Very few people see, know about, and follow how this larger, yes, I would say less visible set of implementing legislation is adopted. Yet, to get familiarized with this reality is crucial for your understanding of how Europe works. But how can we explain the existence of two sets of regulations, the general ones and the technical ones? Why does the EU adopt so many regulations outside of the legislative process involving the three major institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council? Well, as most of you know, new policies and their legislative texts may be quite lengthy and detailed. Yet, they are never able to completely explain all the practical and technical details that are necessary to make them operational, that is, to implement them, to turn them into reality. Therefore, in order to complete the adoption and ensure the implementation of many policies, countries around the world, including the EU, entrust governments to adopt legislations that aim to implement policy measures. This is crucial in order to avoid starting another lengthy procedure for every small decision necessary to make them operational. Let's do a quiz together. In the European Union, who do you think is entrusted with completing the adoption and ensure the proper implementation of European legislation? The member states, some members of the European Parliament chosen on the basis of their expertise, the European Commission, some committees of specialized representatives from the member states. Well, we will see that the last two answers are both correct, the European Commission, but also some committees of specialized representatives from the member states. The Commission has been assigned to take care of the adoption of those technical decisions. It receives the competence to prepare and adopt these technical regulations from a legislative act, one of those generals, adopted by the European Parliament and the Council. But who has drafted the legislative act foreseeing the delegation of authority to the European Commission? Well, yes, you're right. It is the Commission itself, which has proposed to delegate to itself this authority. But of course, this legislative act has been adopted by the Parliament and the Council, who agreed to delegate to the Commission this specific task. Let's go back to the European Tobacco Regulatory Framework. We have mentioned it several times in this course. A new framework has just been adopted. In this, we have a new policy that mandates, among many other things, the use of mandatory pictorial warnings on cigarette packs. The choice of the images and warnings to affix on the pack will be decided by the Commission itself through a technical regulation, certainly not by the Parliament and the Council. This is a technical regulation. This system, often called comitology, works quite efficiently. This is because technical legislation through this procedure is much faster and flexible than through the legislative procedures. This allows keeping legislation updated quickly on technical details in case of, for example, scientific developments. This, in turn, allows the legislator to concentrate on its core legislative work and move technical work to the level of technical experts who usually assist the European Commission in this task. It is also the right place to deal with technical aspects of the primary legislation. The main players of the European decision-making game, the Parliament and the Council, often do not really have the time necessary to look at this and do not have the expertise to legislate on all matters falling within the scope of the adopted legislation. For example, the European Parliament should not spend precious hours discussing the dimensions to which the car's wheels have to comply in order to be imported into the European market. The European Commission Directorate General in charge of the legislation will do that, taking into account scientific studies and asking for advice of committees of experts from different member states and other sources of expertise. Of course, this delegation to the European Commission is not without limits. Everything the European Commission does is subject to the scrutiny of the European Parliament and the Council, although the Parliament hardly ever vetoes the Commission in that procedure. Critics also say that comitology also raises questions for the transparency of the decision-making process and more generally of accountability of European institutions. These committees are famous for being not particularly transparent, and therefore it is quite difficult for citizens but also companies to understand what is actually going on during the preparation of those acts.